Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast. My statistics report for the podcast tell me that about 89% of my listeners are in North America. So that likely means that many listeners may not be aware of parallel developments of Lutheranism in other parts of the world, especially Australia. I'm surprised to see how many origins, divisions, and developments within Australian Lutheranism were so similar to many American Lutheran groups. While we certainly don't have enough time to cover nearly 200 years of history in any great detail, I think our audience would appreciate and benefit from a brief overview of Australian Lutheranism. It turns out a more detailed overview series already exists on YouTube, but rather than have me, an American, summarize something I just listened to, today we have our first international guest. Reverend Jake Zabel is a pastor of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Jake was baptized and raised in the Lutheran Church of Australia. 2017, he joined the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, but he is now a founding member of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. Pastor Zabel, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. I would just correct you that I pronounce it Zabel.
Oh,
I know there's
you?
different pronunciations. Some people pronounce it Zabel. I've anglicized it and we just pronounce it Zabel.
All right, thank you for correcting. I know a bunch of Wisconsin Synod Zabels, so don't know how to say it. Zabel. Okay. Now that's clear to our guests, so we can move forward. So, Pastor Zabel, I've come up with a few. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, with your statistics, does it say how many % listen in Australia or not?
You are number 2, actually, probably because you started looking at it since we first chatted. I think, it's 5 or 6% would be in Australia.
Yeah, good.
So thank you for that boost.
We'll have to get those numbers up.
Oh, well, that's why I like to interview more people, because they get the numbers up and we spread it around. So mutually beneficial here, I hope. So I've come up with a few questions for you that I hope that will give us a good idea of the timeline and developments of Australian Lutheranism without getting too overwhelmed. Now, you've created several very useful charts and diagrams outlining the various Lutheran synods in Australia, something students of American Lutheranism might be familiar with for the American versions. So if you want to follow along with the visual aid, please check out the links in the episode description. So now to begin our questions, could you tell us briefly what were the various origins of Lutherans in Australia in the mid-1800s?
So there's really 4 main groups that you could look at. There was the first 3 groups that all arrived in the same year of 1838, which was a few months apart. The first group were the Gosner missionaries. So these came from the kind of Lutheran, kind of non-denominational Gosner Mission Seminary, and about 8 missionaries from there came to minister to the Australian Aboriginals around the Brisbane area in Queensland, or what is now Queensland. The states weren't really divided back then how they are now. And then you had the Dresden missionaries that arrived not long after. They came from the Dresden Missionary Society. There was only about 2 to start with. They were later joined by another 2. Again, they came to minister to the Australian Aboriginals down in South Australia, down around the Adelaide area. There is actually, if you go to Adelaide, there's actually a little monument and little statues and stuff there to commemorate the Dresden missionaries and their ministry there. And then the main group that really came was what was known as Carvel's people. So there was Pastor August Carvel was the old Lutheran. He was one of those guys that protested the Prussian Union over in Prussia, and he was persecuted for that. And he led a bunch of people out to Australia from Prussia. Australia wasn't their first choice. Apparently, they had attempted to go to the Russian Empire in the Caucasus area, but that kind of fell apart, and they ended up getting some money from a guy in England and got a ship out to Australia. And that was the main 3 groups that started in Australia. You later then get the Victorian Lutherans showing up in the 1849. These Lutherans don't come out for any particular reason like the other ones. They were just normal immigrants to the area, and they just happened to be Lutheran. And so those Lutherans that came to Victoria were a mix of the old Lutherans that protested the Prussian Union, and then a bunch of Lutherans that had come out of the Prussian Union Church, or the State Church of Prussia, I think was the official name of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And just to point out to listeners who maybe aren't aware, those same exact groups, even the same missionary societies, were active in North America too. Old Lutherans were immigrating, so I guess it just makes sense. They didn't just focus in one region of the world when they left Europe. They spread to Australia as well. So a lot of parallels there. But we'll focus more on the Australian stuff some more. So now you've written a short book on Pastor Schiermeister, the father of the Lutheran Church in Queensland. So what made Pastor Schiermeister stand out to you as someone worthy of research?
So, well, this project itself started as a research paper while I was studying at seminary. We had to just pick a figure to research, and while searching around at the early Lutheran figures, I came across Pastor Schiermeister, and myself, having grown up in Queensland, I was quite interested in the Queensland Lutherans. But I took my paper and had to write a book on it with a bit more in-depth study, just because of how interesting Pastor Schiermeister was. And what I do find interesting is that he was kind of more of a liberal Lutheran, and so probably if he was around today, or I was alive in his time, we probably wouldn't be in church fellowship, so we probably wouldn't be the best of friends. But I have to just admire the effort and work that he did. So basically, he came out with the Gosner missionaries originally to New Zealand. He was ministering to the Maoris over there, but after just a failed mission and due to his own deteriorating health, he was originally planning to go back to Germany. But before he could go back to Germany, he had to come over to Sydney, Australia, where he was recovering. While there, turns out his brother-in-law was part of the second group of Gosner missionaries to Queensland. So there was the first group in 1838 I mentioned, and another group came out in 1844. And one of those, Pastor Garrick, was Pastor Schiermeister's brother-in-law. And so Pastor Garrick asked Pastor Schiermeister if he would come up and help him with the mission. Pastor Schiermeister did, and he did that for a bit before he said that the Aboriginal mission was also a failure, and it was time to just abandon it and to divert their resources towards the Lutheran immigrants. So this is around now in the 1850s, so you've now started to have a lot more people immigrating to Australia, and there are a lot of Lutherans in Queensland. And Pastor Schiermeister went about establishing congregations, helping train pastors, getting pastors sent over from Europe. One thing that I really admire about him is there's 3 cities in Queensland. There's the capital city, Brisbane, then there's 2 other cities, Ipswich and Toowoomba. So from Brisbane to Ipswich is about an hour and a half cars drive, and from Brisbane to Toowoomba is about 3 hours cars drive. Schiermeister used to take Sunday services at Brisbane, Ipswich and Toowoomba every Sunday, and he would go by horseback. So I always admire the fact that he was, what's like a 3-hour car drive from me, he was doing on horseback to take word and sacrament to people every Sunday. And then that was just Sunday. During the week, he would then ride off into the bush and go help minister to like little outreach communities and help establish Lutheran congregations around the place. And what is also interesting about Pastor Schiermeister is, although he came from the Gosner Missionary Society or Seminary, and he was a bit more liberal, unlike the other Gosner pastors, Schiermeister had actually studied the Book of Concord. So he knew the Book of Concord, unlike many of his fellow Gosner pastors. And so this put Pastor Schiermeister in a very interesting position where he was very much in the middle of everyone. He would be like what we'd call like a centrist. So there was the more liberal Lutherans from Gosner, and the more conservative Lutherans that can come out from the Hermannsburg mission seminary. And Pastor Schurmeister was really the bridge between those two groups. And had circumstances gone differently, he probably would have managed to unite all the churches in Queensland into a single synod. But then circumstances were as they were, and that didn't happen. But we can get to those details with some later on when we get to some different questions.
Yeah, and maybe it's a good time to ask the next question. What were some of those early causes of division? I mean, we have to face it. People came for different reasons from different places. They weren't automatically united when they arrived. But what caused division, or maybe a better question is, what kept Lutherans divided?
Cool. Well, you've got another question coming up about whether divisions were more about personality or principles. I might combine those two questions together because some of the divisions are going to be personality. So if I look at my own chart that I've got here, some of the first divisions were between guys like Pastor Carvel and another pastor called Pastor Fritzer. So Fritzer was another one of these old Lutherans that had been persecuted in Prussia, and he came out in 1841. And him and Carvel had attempted fellowship, but there were a couple of theological issues such as millennialism. So Pastor Carvel was a premillennialist. Pastor Carvel, so the question of whether it was personalities or principles, with Pastor Carvel, a lot of it was personality. Pastor Carvel really thought he was basically the next Luther. When he came to Australia, he wrote this thing called the Apostolic Constitution, which was like his own statement of faith that he said nobody could be a Lutheran unless they held to it. Although he wrote also this document called the Protestations, which was a list of 6 issues with the Book of Concord that he disagreed with. So he actually rejected some of the teachings of the Book of Concord. And like I said, he was a premillennialist. And there's a lot of, while there were theological issues, a lot of it more was his personality. He just kind of was, he was right, everybody else was wrong, he wouldn't budge. And then that's then led to the split between his group and Pastor Fritz's group. Fritz's group would eventually go on to form what we would know as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, or ELSA for short. Fritz's group itself went and had a split after Fritz's death, because Fritzer was the president, and when he died, there was this new question of who was going to be the next president, and there was a Pastor Urch and a Pastor Studenmeyer, and they argued over who was going to be the next president. And when the synod sided with one of them, the other guy basically sulked and went and formed his own synod. So you had these kind of issues going on. So there's a lot of personality issues. There were theological issues. So, for example, the Victorian Synod, one of the big issues for why it never had fellowship with like the ELSA, with either Fritz's group or Carvel's group, was the fact that the Victorian Synod had come out of the state church of Prussia, and they were kind of very ecumenical, whereas a lot of the pastors they called were not Lutheran. So they were calling pastors from the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and groups like that. So they were calling non-Lutherans, and even like basically having fellowship already with non-Lutherans back then. So that was a big issue of division. Up in Queensland, what really happened up there was you had the pastors from the Gosner Seminary and the Basel Seminary, which were more liberal, and the pastors from the Hermannsburg Seminary, which were more conservative. And those were theological divisions. But then what really happened was there was 2 main figures, Pastor Schurmeister we mentioned before, and a Pastor Saltman from the Hermannsburg group. And they were basically the 2 leaders. And they were sorting out issues, and they were actually finding a lot of agreement, and there was this potential union. They'd actually met in like constitution, and there was a lot of hope that they would actually end up becoming one synod. What happened was the Victorian synod had already formed back in the 50s, and they were putting pressure on Queensland to hurry up and get organised into a synod so that they could establish official church fellowship. And so a particular pastor from down in Victoria had come up and basically put the pressure on Schurmeister to hurry up and get things organised. So what happened was Schurmeister just called together the other Gosner Basil pastors on his side and just quickly formed what was called the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, or just the Queensland Synod for short. And his hope was that he'd form the synod, and then he'd tell the Hermannsburg guys that, okay, well, we've formed a synod, so you can come join us now. And the Hermannsburg pastors were rightfully offended, and they're like, well, you guys didn't invite us to the actual formation of the synod. You didn't let us come to the conference. There's still disagreements that we haven't sorted out yet. We're not joining with you. And they went and formed what was called the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. So quite a long name and a long acronym. I like to call them the UGS for short. So United German and Scandinavian. And there was a lot of, there were theological differences, but quite a lot of time there were a lot of personalities that really affected either unions or divisions.
Yeah. And by giving us that answer, you kind of gave us an outline of what the different synods were, at least some of them. I guess the follow-up question, do you think culture, was that part of that too? I noticed you said even the Germans and Scandinavian immigrants got together. Was that ever an issue as well?
Kind of. So the reason why they called themselves the German and Scandinavian Synod was that there was two pastors and congregations that were Danish at that point in time. And the Danish pastors remained in the synod for about 12 months before they split off and basically became their own little. They didn't actually form a synod. They just were basically independent Danish churches at that point in time. So there was a bit of a cultural difference there in Queensland, at least, between the Danish and the Germans. So yeah, the Danes were originally there, but then they basically like, no, we're not sticking around, and left.
Yeah, makes sense. And it was difficult for in North America, many probably more Norwegians than Danish, but they kept to themselves, and the Germans kept to themselves, even if they had a fellowship understanding.
We didn't seem to have too many of those other like non-German Lutheran groups in Australia. We would like kind of post the World Wars, we got a lot more of European immigration over here. This is like way down the line, but post World War II, we got a lot of Lutheran immigrants from Latvia. So basically every capital city in Australia now has like a Latvian Lutheran congregation that are they're all connected with the state church of Latvia. But yeah, we haven't really had too many like non-German Lutherans apart from the Danes, at least up until kind of like the last 50, 60 years or so, when we started getting the post-World War II immigration.
Interesting. So you mentioned some of the synods and fellowships or federations, whatever we'd like to call them. Are there any others that you think we should know about if you're giving a general overview of Lutheranism in Australia?
Okay, well, I might as well just break down the general overview. So you've got the ELSA, which was Fritz's synod. You've got a group called the full name Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, or just known as Emmanuel for short. They were basically Carvel's synod. So as I mentioned before, after Carvel's death, his synod split in two. Later, those two little groups managed to reconcile, get back together, and form the Emmanuel Synod. Then the Emmanuel Synod and the UGS would eventually, in the early 1900s, form what they called the Evangelical Lutheran Church Federation, or just Church Federation for short. And then there was another group called the General Synod. These are like federations, like I think the Synodical Conference was, where they were more like a group of synods. And the General Synod was made up of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis. And what happened there was I'll get the exact year, back in 1876, the Emmanuel Synod and the Victorian Synod had formed the General Synod. However, in 1884, the Emmanuel Synod decided to break fellowship and leave the General Synod over the issue of the ecumenicism in the Victorian Synod. However, there were a group of pastors and congregations that didn't want to break fellowship with Victoria, and so they split off and formed what they called the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, and so they then stayed in fellowship with Victoria. And so they're kind of your three main groupings. There's the ELSA, the Church Federation, and the General Synod. There was another little group as well called the ELSA Old Basis. So we'll get to this later, but the ELSA had entered into fellowship with the Missouri Synod and had started to adopt a lot of the Missouri Synod positions on things, particularly the Missouri Synod's position on closed communion. And this would, in the early 1900s, lead to a bunch of pastors and that splitting from the ELSA over the issue of church fellowship, because they wanted a more selective fellowship. So by that, I mean, long history short, Fritzer had actually been pretty loose on church fellowship. And for most of the 1800s, the ELSA had also been very loose on church fellowship, not open communion, but more of a selective fellowship where they would like, okay, well, those pastors and those congregations are conservative, so we're going to have fellowship with them, but those guys aren't, so we can't. And that was the position of the ELSA for most of the 1800s until they entered into fellowship with Missouri and kind of took a stricter position on closed communion. And basically, you had some pastors in the ELSA that didn't want a stricter position on closed communion. They preferred the looser practice on Holy Communion, and so they ended up splitting off. The way they split, there was 4 pastors that split. One pastor just went and joined the UGS. One pastor, his parish remained independent. And then the 2 other pastors, they were a father and son, they formed the ELSA Old Basis Synod, which would eventually go on to actually become a district. It was the Australian district of the Ohio Synod. So they would actually enter into fellowship with Ohio.
Yeah, interesting. And now that you brought up Missouri and Ohio synods, we're talking about American Lutheran synods. And let's talk a bit more about that. To your knowledge, how was Lutheranism in Australia similar to Lutheranism in America during the 19th century, even early 20th century?
So I saw this question when you sent me the list of questions, and I thought, well, I know a lot about Australian Lutheranism, but I don't really know a lot about American Lutheranism. So, I mean, one thing I do know is that there was a split with Missouri ended up having splits with groups like Iowa and Ohio. And what happened in Australia was you had churches that would unite with those guys. So like the Emmanuel Synod did end up having fellowship with Iowa. And as I mentioned, the ELSA Old Basis had fellowship with Ohio. And the ELSA had fellowship with Missouri. As for the General Synod, I don't know if they really had much fellowship at that point. The later iteration of them, which we'll get to later, they did end up joining the Lutheran World Federation, and so you've got stuff like that happening, but that's getting more towards the 1930s before any of that happened. So I'll let you, I think you know a bit more about American history, so you tell me what similarities you see, and I'll be able to comment on those.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of have the opposite problem, where I know a bit about American Lutheranism, but next to nothing about the stuff in Australia. And that's kind of why we're having this conversation today, is kind of bridge the gaps. But I noticed some part of it's just the timeline. You mentioned 1838 as kind of the pivotal year. And of course, there were Lutherans in America for over a century. by that time in the British colonies. But you see a big shift starting around 1838. You have a guy that I focus on in my research, Friedrich Wyneken, comes over as an individual pastor wanting to do mission work, but that's also the year you see the Saxons go, or at least start their journey to St. Louis in Missouri, and that's where you get at least a part, not all, but a part of the Missouri Synod was part of that old Lutheran immigration, and you have other Prussian old Lutherans immigrate from that year. So I already mentioned that earlier, but you see the Gosner missionaries, the Dresden Missionary Society. But I've also noticed the similarities too, where people are trying to found all these various synods. And sometimes the question is it just because we like this I don't want to say charismatic in that sense, but a good leader as an individual, or are we all united around a common understanding of what it means to be a Lutheran? I think whether it's to Australia, I would assume, or to America, there's definitely kind of an identity crisis. We leave our home, we leave our culture, we leave our language. In both cases, it's to an English dominant society, English language at least. How do we handle that transition? And how does that form our identity? Is it around culture? Is it around faith? And I think just what I hear about Australian Lutheranism seems to have a parallel there. So that was just a curious question. And if you notice something, we'll talk about it. But if that's it, that's it.
Well, I'll mention two comments. One is a similarity, and I'll come to that in a second. One was just an extra point I wanted to bring up, was you mentioned how, like in America, there had been Lutherans in America for like a century prior to this. So pretty much in Australia, we really started in 1838 was when the first missionaries and first pastors and congregations came. Although, according to the history books, there were Lutherans in Australia as early as 1806. Apparently, there were some winemakers and stuff in the New South Wales, in the Hunter River region, though they're not really normally included much in the histories because basically they were just immigrants, but they never formed a congregation. They had no pastor. So maybe they had some private Lutheran worship, but eventually they basically just absorbed into the rest of the Australian churches around here, which, again, we're talking about Pastor Schurmeister earlier. That's one other thing that stands out interesting with Pastor Schurmeister is many of those Gosner missionaries that came over to Australia, many of them just after they kind of gave up on the Aboriginal mission, just went and joined the local churches, whether that be Methodist, Anglican, Presbyterian. Although I keep using the word Anglican, I think you guys call them Episcopalians or whatever in America. It's the Church of England.
Right. It had when you rebel against your government and the head of the church is no longer the head of your nation, you change the name. But we understand that as Anglican too.
The Gosner pastors kind of just joined them, and that's where Pastor Schurmeister really stood out as well, where he's like, no, I'm staying Lutheran, I'm establishing Lutheran churches. But one similarity I think I could see was there's the guy, Pastor Martin Stephanus, I think his name was, the guy who really helped basically the first bishop or whatever you want to call him of Missouri Synod, whatever he tried to establish himself was. I see quite a lot of parallels between him and Pastor Carvel. I mean, I think there's some kind of sex scandals with Pastor Stephanus. Carvel didn't really have that, but that kind of controlling, I'm in charge, I'm the boss, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, you'll have to listen to me kind of personality I see is kind of very similar between Carvel and Stephanus.
Yeah. And that group, Missouri Synod didn't exist for almost 10 years after that immigration. It was kind of a local, kind of an ethnic Lutheran group of just Saxons in Missouri. And then later, through efforts of people outside of the Saxons, actually, they kind of got together. I can think of a third person who'd easily fit kind of a trio of dominant personality types, and old Lutherans from Prussia who went to America settled around Buffalo, New York, and they formed what is commonly called the Buffalo Synod, although they had a much longer German name than that. And their leader, Grabau, was like that too. And he just kind of said, this is the way it is or else. And they actually couldn't come to an agreement between those old Lutherans in New York and the old Lutherans in Missouri, despite some conversations. So yeah, it's kind of an alphabet soup when you start looking at all the different synod names and their acronyms. But yeah, definitely that old Lutheran commonality too.
Leaves me, I got two questions for you, which may help to see the similarities between Australia and America. Well, one, as I mentioned, with Australia, you had a bunch of old Lutherans come over, but we also had a lot of the Union Lutherans, so the Lutherans out of the Prussian state church. Did you guys have a similar issue in America where you had like both sides coming?
Yep. I mean, you get hundreds of thousands of just general German immigrants. And if you're from Prussia, the largest Protestant part of Germany, just odds are you're going to come from a Union church. Now, even looking at my family tree and ancestors and such, some of them just happened to find themselves close to a confessional conservative Lutheran congregation. And they said, well, they teach the catechism kind of like we have, might as well join them. It's just kind of convenience. Others said, well, we didn't realize we were part of a Union church because our small town in Germany had a conservative pastor who didn't do any of that stuff with the Reformed. And we were in name Prussian Union, but in reality, we were still Old Lutheran, even if we didn't use that name. But yes, there were quite a few of the Prussian Union people coming over too, just by it's a statistical reality. Many of them would come over. There was an attempt to found a Union synod called the Kirchenverein, which just means church club or church society. And that took off, and it's still in existence today. And if you look around the area where I grew up in central southeastern Wisconsin, you have a lot of churches called the United Church of Christ. And they are basically our closest denominational relatives who don't bear the name Lutheran. They're basically the Prussian Union Church, totally different name, and they've merged with some Zwinglians, basically. But they're still alive and well in parts of America.
Well, I did say I had two questions, but I'm going to add a third one in there as well. But this will be the third one I was going to add in. You're talking about the union with the Zwinglians. So, like in Australia, for your listeners that know of the Moravian Brethren, so the Hussites, as we know, there were a bunch of different Hussites in Australia, and mostly in Victoria and South Australia. A lot of the Hussite churches ended up just kind of being absorbed into the Lutheran churches. So we had some of the South Australian and Victorian churches, which are kind of basically Hussite heritage mixed in there with them, but then they were more liberal Lutheran churches anyway, so they were already out of the Union Church, so they're basically Calvinist Lutherans anyway. So chucking the Hussites in there wasn't
a stretch.
Too different. But one question I had there was millennialism. So that was like, especially in early 1800s Australia, it kind of faded out as a background question as we get into the 1900s, and then in the 1960s it was officially condemned. But in the early 1800s, the debate over millennialism was quite a big issue in Australia. Was that much of a debate over millennialism in America or not?
Absolutely, in some circles especially. There's a region of Germany, even to this day, that there's like Slavic Germans, the Wends or Wends, I think they're called. And there was one of a Wendish pastor, and his name eludes me for the moment, but I'll remember it as soon as this is over, I'm sure. He was down in Texas, and he had some millennialism ideas, and he was kind of close to the Missouri Synod on everything except, I believe, millennialism was an issue. I'm not too aware of much more about him. But that was a big issue with the Iowa Synod. The Iowa Synod had what they called open questions. Basically, we can't really be too sure about this or that. We might as well let people agree to disagree on some of these issues. And I think they had 4 open questions that they officially said these are open questions. We don't have to have agreement on it to have fellowship. And one of them, I think, was on fellowship itself, which was kind of ironic. But millennialism was another one. So if you had a pastor in the Missouri Synod who kind of went off the deep end into premillennialism, he wouldn't have a hard time leaving and joining the Iowa Synod. And in the 1850s, the guy I kind of focus on, Winnikin, he has to deal with an issue with a pastor who seems to be struggling with which kind of millennialism is correct. The other area where millennialism pops up.
I was just gonna.
Oh, sure.
I was just gonna say that kind of explains then why the Emmanuel Synod, which was Carvel's eventual synod, why they actually entered into fellowship with Iowa and why they kind of got on well there. So, yeah. Millennialism, they were both kind of millennialists, and that makes sense.
It seems like the different synods in these two continents are gravitating toward each other based on their, really boils down to doctrine at this point, not by geographic convenience by any means. Do you know how they got into contact with each other? Because I'm unaware of that.
The Iowa and Emmanuel. So that was through, I don't know how to pronounce their name because it's really Germany long name. Over in Papua New Guinea, there's the how do I say that? It was the mission over in Papua New Guinea. I'll try and find the actual word. Noonan Dettel Sal.
Oh, Noonan Dettel Sal.
I don't know if you know how to.
Yep.
Yeah, those guys. So they were doing mission work over in Papua New Guinea, and basically both Australia and the Emmanuel Synod in Australia and the Iowa Synod had connections through the mission there in Papua New Guinea, and that's really what got them into fellowship. I think it wasn't until 1921 when the what was then called the United Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, we'll get to those guys as well, the UELCA, that they actually officially declared fellowship with Iowa. But the Emmanuel Synod kind of had an unofficial fellowship with Iowa for probably going back to like the 1890s or so. They just they had joint mission work, and they didn't seem to have problems with sharing pastors and communing each other. So it wasn't like an official fellowship until the 1920s.
Okay. So I suspect that the common thread then would actually trace itself back to Germany, nothing direct between Australia and the United States. It would be through those mission societies, because that Neuen Detelsau, that's totally dominated by the individual Wilhelm Leah. He's a major figure. The Missouri Synod kind of calls him a father from afar. He sent out colonies of maybe more neo-confessional Lutherans versus old Lutherans, but very similar in some ways, and also sent individual pastors. And this was kind of where Winnikin makes the connection between Leah and Missouri Synod. It all ties together there with the Saxons and such. But they had a disagreement with Walther. Winnikin went on a trip to see Leah in Germany, and they couldn't agree on some of those church and ministry issues. And the Iowa Synod is basically the people who stayed loyal to Leah in the Neuen Detelsau group. So that explains why Neuen Detelsau people in your corner of the world would make that connection with so Iowa.
Just to clarify, because you're saying Leah, but that's L-O-H-E? That's how
L-O-E or L-O umlaut H-E, yeah.
Yeah. So Loa is how they pronounce it in Australia. What's interesting is because he had a big influence in Australia, and there is the library at the Adelaide Seminary is the Loa Seminary, or Leah Seminary. It's named after him.
Yeah, and I'm sure there may be a scholar on him who's just laughing at how ignorant we both are of the connection that we're just now discovering, but I'm sure other people are well aware of this, and we're just stumbling into it. But it is interesting to draw those dots and make the connections. So yeah, it seems to me then that there's the Germany basis is how these synods in North America and Australia got in contact.
I have one question for you. Did you guys ever have any Lutheran communists? This is an interesting character in our history. I don't know if you guys had any. We had a guy over here called Crumnow. He came over with Pastor Fritzter on their ship, and I think you had very similar things with like the early Missouri guys and the early Australian guys, where when they immigrated over, they basically had these little kind of Lutheran towns, which were basically everyone in town was Lutheran, and like basically the pastor was kind of doubled as the mayor of the town as well, and stuff like that. They were like all these immigration towns. But yeah, this guy Crumnow, who was like a proper full-on Marxist and really wanted them to adopt a very kind of communist style over here in Australia, and he ended up kind of being excommunicated, and so he then took off to Victoria and founded his own little Lutheran commune over there that lasted it only fell apart with his death. It lasted from 1844 through to 1880, so not quite 40 years. Had this little Lutheran communist group in Victoria.
Mentioned in your video series that ELSA had some rapid growth in the early 20th century. What caused that?
So a mixture of a few things. I do think their fellowship with Missouri was a big help. They got a lot of support from Missouri. Really kind of two things. One was English. I don't know about the other states, but in Queensland, the ELSA congregations were the first ones to start using English in their services. They stopped using German, started using English. And according to the history books, there's actually got a massive influx of youth. A lot of the younger youth congregations in the other synods in Queensland decided to jump over to the ELSA for the sake of using English. So that was the main reason in Queensland. And another reason with the ELSA is kind of a little bit of just luck and right moment, right time, right place. Kind of what happened was a lot of the synods didn't really do mission very well. So the UGS and the Victorian Synod and the Queensland Synod never did any mission. The ELSA really put a lot of effort into mission. So the New Zealand Church, which was like the Concordia Lutheran Conference of New Zealand, they ended up joining the ELSA and became the New Zealand district of the ELSA because of the ELSA's mission over there. The ELSA did help Missouri do some mission work in Papua New Guinea, but the ELSA also, it did mission work to the other states in Australia. It actually spread and established congregations, and ELSA had this interesting thing of not forming church like intersynodical bodies like the others. So like the Emmanuel Synod never saw a reason to have congregations in Queensland because they just entered into fellowship with the UGS. And so, well, why do you guys look after Queensland, we'll look after South Australia. The ELSA never did this. They kind of always had this idea of it just establishing districts. And so, like I mentioned, when they entered into fellowship with the New Zealand Church, rather than have the New Zealand Church remain as a separate synodical body, it was absorbed into the ELSA as the New Zealand district. So they kind of really kept their church body as one body. But there was a lot of just right place at the right time, because the Emmanuel Synod had attempted missions. They did have missions in the Aboriginals in Central Australia, and they did have missions to Papua New Guinea. And they did, for a brief period of time, have missions to the states of Tasmania and Western Australia. But both those missions fell apart and they just abandoned them. Whereas the ELSA, when they attempted their missions to Western Australia and Tasmania at a different time, and just for them, it just seemed to flourish. Western Australia, I don't know exactly why it flourished there so better. The Tasmanian one, that's easily explained that the ELSA mission to Tasmania started in the mid-1940s. So post-World War II, and they got a lot of post-World War II European immigrants come to Tasmania as well that they managed to pick up and form congregations there. But yeah, so there was a lot of just right time and right place that they really kind of just fluked it. Although, I mean, I could argue as well and just say that they were also a very solid synod, and they were very strict on fellowship and doctrinal purity. And so there wasn't a lot of little infighting and divisions over this doctrine or that doctrine, because they were pretty much like, well, this is our statement. You don't agree with it, get out, go join somewhere else. Whereas the other synods were a lot more diverse and, you know, would have had their own little internal conflicts. It is interesting to know, like you talk about the rapid growth, like eventually you end up with two synods in Australia, the ELSA, later called the ELCA, and the UELCA group. And it's interesting to point out that the UELCA was a union of 6 synods, and it was only after that union that they were of equal size with the ELSA. So it does go to show you that sometimes confessional Lutheranism can be the biggest group.
Yeah. For a while, that was also true in North America, too. But we're not going back there, so we'll stay on topic. So you've written another short book, The Forgotten Synod, A History of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australasia. I think I pronounced that right, but you can correct me. Can you tell us a bit about this synod and its origins in the early 20th century?
These guys are great. So they're shorthand, we just call them Alcasia, is what they're referred to as. So the reason why I decided to write a book on these is for 2 reasons. One is that, as I titled the book, The Forgotten Synod, most people don't know about this synod. Most of the history books don't talk about this synod. If you read through the history books of like the UELCA or the ELCA, they'll mention the Alcasia as like a little paragraph, like a passing reference, like, oh, this group existed at this point in time. And that's about it. It turns out that my great-great-grandfather was the treasurer when they first formed the synod. So that's how I also had a slight family connection. Although not necessarily something to be proud of, because this synod was like super liberal. And when I say super liberal, I mean kind of very liberal. So the origins of their stories goes back to the early 1900s. I'll just get my charts up here. So about 1911 is when it really kind of starts their history. There was a pastors' conference where the Brisbane congregation called St. Andrews, they brought up a proposal to enter into church fellowship with the state church. So they wanted to, with the state union church, so the state church of Prussia, they wanted to enter into fellowship with them. And it was voted down at the pastors' conference. They said, no, we don't want to enter into fellowship with the state church. Yes, many of us came from the state church. Many of us have had connections with the state church. But the main reason they didn't want to was that they were worried that them entering into fellowship with the state church would hinder fellowship with the other synods in Australia. Also, I don't think I mentioned this. This is the Queensland Synod. So the Gosner Basil guys, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, they had this pastors' conference, and the Brisbane congregation wanted fellowship with Prussia. And so they didn't do that. The Brisbane church just went ahead and did it. They just went ahead, contacted the Prussian church, entered into official altar pulpit church fellowship with the state church. And then what happened was at the 1912 synodical conference, the Brisbane congregation said, we've entered into fellowship with them, and we want to pass a resolution that says that each individual congregation reserves the right to decide their own fellowship. So basically selective fellowship. They like, you guys don't want to fellowship with Prussia, we do. You guys don't have to, we will. Again, that resolution was voted down. But there was 5 pastors and their congregations that were in favor of this resolution, and so they broke off and formed the Alcasia. The reason they called themselves Alcasia rather than like Australasia rather than Australia was that according to the history, there was a German pastor in Samoa who was a missionary who entered into fellowship with them. I don't know much about him because, again, this whole synod, there is not a lot of information on it. To write this book, I had to research newspaper clippings, church minutes, and the little bits of information I could scrape together. But basically, I had 5 pastors and about 8 congregations formed this group called the Alcasia. They were then joined by another pastor and their congregation about central Queensland, which were they were an actual church plant of the State Church of Prussia, so they were already in fellowship. What is interesting to note is that the Alcasia did not, the entire synod didn't enter into fellowship with the State Church. That wasn't ever the point. Like, the congregations that formed the Alcasia, it wasn't that they wanted fellowship with Prussia. They just agreed with this practice of allowing each congregation to choose their own fellowship. So even though these other 4 pastors and their congregations were part of the Alcasia, they didn't want fellowship with Prussia. They never entered into fellowship with Prussia. They just agreed with Brisbane's idea that each congregation had the right to choose their own fellowship. And so this group forms in 1912. And then there comes this incident in 1914, which I hope your listeners know what happened in 1914. What happened in 1914, Benjamin?
Well, we may have been oblivious to the fact until 1917, but yes, the Great War may have happened or begun in 1914.
Oh yeah, that's right, because you guys stayed out of it for a long time in America. No, being a British colony, we were in it from the get-go, and so you had issues, and a lot of Lutheran pastors in Australia, I think this is one of your later questions as well, I talk about now, a lot of Lutherans got persecuted during World War One. A lot of Germans had to anglicize their name or just change their surname entirely. A lot of German towns adopted new names. A lot of Lutheran congregations had to close down. A lot of them that were still using German services now switched to English services to avoid persecution. And there were a lot of pastors that got arrested as suspected spies. And amongst the pastors of the Alcasia, there was 6 pastors in total in Australia. 5 out of the 6 got arrested, and 2 of them actually got deported back to Germany. And so the Alcasia just fell apart. The congregations that made up the Alcasia, many of them remained independent for a number of years following this. But as of 1914, the organization itself was basically non-existent. Basically, you had pastors and congregations left over, but they were pretty much on their own now. If I can, I know we're probably going a bit long, but if I can just have a quick moment, one interesting story was what happened with the Brisbane congregation. So, come 1921, the ULCA formed. The Brisbane congregation at this point in time was still independent. And there was a debate on whether they should join the ULCA or the ELCA. Some of the pastors some of the congregation wanted to join the ELCA. Now, the congregation at this point in time was independent, but it was being served by a pastor from the ULCA. But I think a majority of the congregation voted they wanted to join the ELCA instead. Or at this point in time, it's still called the ELSA, and they went and called a pastor from the ELCA to come serve them. And this got into a big mess because they told the ULCA guys, they said, okay, our pastor's coming on this day, he's having his installation on this day, we need the church. And the ULCA people refused, and they locked the church, forcing the ELCA guys to break a window to get in to unlock the church so that they could have their service on Sunday. Following that, the ELCA guys left 2 people continuously as guards on the church to stop the ULCA guys from coming back. This forced the ULCA guys to hold their church services in the manse. Up until one day when the
Can I just
ULCA
interject there?
pastor... Go on.
I had to look this up in your video. In America, we call the manse the parsonage. So that's the house that
Gotcha.
the pastor lives in next door, correct? So yeah, just so people listening can understand that. Please continue.
Cheers. So one day the Uelka pastor was in his office at the manse or parsonage. His wife and his teenage daughter were doing housework, and the Elka congregation members showed up and said, "You got to get out of the manse because we need it for the Elka pastor. So get out." And so they didn't fight. The pastor and his family got up and left. The Elka members moved all the furniture in the house into a back room. They then had painters who were coming to repaint the property before the Elka pastor moved in, had the painters come in. The Elka guys started moving a bit of the Elka pastor's furniture onto the veranda area, or I think you guys porch or whatever you guys call it in America. And then they left. What happened at nightfall was the Uelka guys showed up, told the painters to get out of there. They started grabbing the Elka pastor's furniture and started chucking it into the street. This led the Elka guys to show up, and one thing led to another. Names were called. Somebody picked up a brick and threw it and hit someone in the head, and basically a brawl broke out there in the street between the Elka laity and the Uelka laity, and police had to come and break it all up, and the issue was taken to court, and the court decided to award the property to the Uelka members, which then forced the Elka members to go and start their own congregation, Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Brisbane. So I just thought I'd mention that story because it's very interesting to see, I don't know, the kind of violence there was back in those days.
Yeah, not very good for PR, public relations.
Just trying to imagine like something like that happening today.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have gone down well.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of a brief history of Lutheranism in Australia. Jake and I chatted a bit off air after we recorded a nearly 2-hour session of an overview, and we both agreed maybe breaking this into 2 parts would be appropriate. We discussed how this is not really a normal procedure for this podcast, whereas normally I focus on one specific topic, almost always a book or at least a scholarly article that was written on a subject. Yet, just from my own experience and knowing at least some of the audience members that we have, most of whom, as I mentioned earlier, are in the United States, I thought it was still beneficial for us to have an overview episode on Australian Lutheranism, and in this case, it was necessary to do 2 overview episodes. So thank you for sitting through on this. I hope you found it beneficial, even if it was not the typical kind of interview for this podcast. Later in the next episode, I do ask Pastor Zabel if he had any comments on his research method and also his other interests for Lutheran history. So we have those typical questions. They'll just be out in 15 days. So I hope you liked this episode. And if you did, please like it, share, and subscribe.